Professor Tootle, welcome to our 32nd show. I'm making that up. I have no idea if it's 32. But
I was going to be really impressed if we had actually done 30.
No, it's somewhere between 25 and 40. I just have, I'll add it up at some point. This, in some ways, is the easiest of shows, conversations, because 90% of Americans, I don't know about worldwide, but 90% of Americans are saying stupid stuff on the interwebs. Just across the spectrum, they say, I hate mask, or I love mask, or that's unconstitutional, or it is. I'm telling you, 90% of Americans are just throwing stuff up against the wall, and I'm not sure they understand federalism. I truly don't think they understand our system of governance between a local board and a state law versus local healthcare regulation versus the power of the president versus what I truly don't think they understand our system. And I don't mean to criticize society. I really don't. But the context of this conversation is mask mandates, vaccines, and mandatory testing, all sorts of nuances in relationship of governments. You are a subject matter expert on the second. I assume you're not a subject matter expert on vaccines or mask and their efficiencies or whether testing counts. I assume you're not a scientific expert. Is that correct?
Yeah, I don't have any.
Yeah, and neither am I. But I'm hoping that between the two of us and our questioners, we're going to be able to provide some value to whoever.
We lost your audio, John.
John, we lost your audio, sir. Keep at it.
Maybe.
Me now.
Yeah,
now you're in. Now you're in. You're back in, John.
I promise you, I spend thousands of dollars a month on this internet connection, and somebody owes me money, some big corporation. So, Professor, what I was saying is that although we don't provide scientific expertise, the setting of federalism and local, state, federal government, how our society works can provide value to whoever watches this so they can make their best arguments, not a silly argument. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Cool. So why don't you, if this is the first show that anyone dials in on, and there are two people that this is the first show they've ever listened to, and there'll be hundreds and thousands of people watching in the future. Why don't you give just 30 seconds or a minute of your bona fides? Who are you, Professor?
I'm professor of history at College of the Sequoias, and I have a PhD in modern U.S. history from Ohio University. My secondary field was U.S. intellectual history, and then third and fourth fields in European intellectual history and Soviet history. I've written mostly about American ideals and institutions for the better, and taught history for the better part of 20 years, in addition to lots of work as former work as a partisan political hack, but that kind of went away about 5 years ago. So,
yeah, makes sense. You were an expert on American government and contemporary history of the United States.
History, yes.
Maybe a little bit later, but
yeah. Okay.
I don't know what you did.
Now,
Ron.
What is that? Is that Ron?
Ron needs to mute himself.
We need somebody to mute themselves. They're getting background noise.
There you go.
There we go. Okay, so Professor, as I always like to do, I like to go way back in history to see if there's any context that applies at all. I don't assume we don't need to go back into 1813 when James Madison signed an act of Congress to encourage vaccinations. It was encouraging vaccinations. Do we need to talk about old time history in this conversation, or do we need to jump up to the 1905 major Supreme Court decision on this, which was Jackson versus Massachusetts? What's your thought historically?
Well, I think you need a little background on the basics of how our government is supposed to work.
Perfect.
And it goes back to so many issues that we've discussed, where the idea of our national government is constituted in order to protect your freedoms, to secure rights. And the major distinction we would make is that the national government is there to make sure that people don't do things to you. And then the way our federal system is set up is that the government that acts upon your life in a direct way is supposed to mostly take place at the state level and at the local level.
Well, I guess I'll ask one direct question on that then, since that's what everybody's talking about. On my Facebook feed, I can show you a dozen posts within the last 24 hours of liberals and conservatives saying, we hate Texas or Florida, or thank God for California putting in mask mandates, or, I mean, across the political spectrum, but everybody's talking about other states' activities of whether they like or hate their regulations. Mm-hmm. Is that helpful? I mean, why do we even have to be talking about that? Why have we nationalized everything?
Well, I suppose the reason why people get so excited about this is because of there's a tendency sometimes at the circuit court level to issue injunctions that will affect people from other states. And okay. I think it might be what might be coming from the Supreme Court in the next, say, 5 years is a clarification on when judges can issue injunctions that will affect people from other circuits. But I think it's one of these things that as it grows in concern and there are conflicting decisions at the circuit court level, the Supreme Court will eventually have to weigh in on this issue. But so there's that sort of basic good reason why people would be concerned about what.
So, Professor, do you really think what you just said? That sure seems academic to me. You think the average citizen is thinking about circuit court decisions and how one state is affecting the other, or do they just see something in the media and they want to rag on it?
Well, I was going to say that's the good reason to be concerned about what's going on in another state. But then there's the silly reason to be upset about what's going on in another state, which would be the assumption that all politics is national and that it is perfectly appropriate to interfere with the goings on in another state when that state is acting appropriately within their state rights.
So why have, do you think the average US citizen, and I'll get a little bit out of opinion.
Oh, we lost your audio again. Okay, try again. Maybe.
Now you can hear me.
Yes, okay.
Good. Do you think the average US citizen cares about the different member nations of the European Union and how they're handling the COVID-19?
Do I think the average person? No.
Yeah. But the different member countries of the European Union are handling it in a divergence of ways.
Yes.
But then we seem to really care about what Texas or California or Massachusetts is. You know, I just don't quite get it why everybody's so upset about different states when they're not so concerned about different countries.
Well, I mean, there's a natural human tendency to. The example I always use is that everybody seemed to care about the lives of Asians when the United States was in the Vietnam War. But as soon as we withdrew, the killing fields happened in Cambodia. And all of a sudden, all of these humanitarians didn't seem to have much energy or care for what was happening in Cambodia. Things that are far away and don't involve direct U.S. interests just don't tend to excite the public.
Okay, but the difference between Utah and New Mexico is more direct to them, so they can, from Colorado.
Yes. And the other thing that has been nationalized is public interest groups. So we have to always make sure that we're distinguishing. Sometimes you say average Facebook user and sometimes you say average citizen. So your average Facebook user or your average Twitter user is someone who is on a bunch of mailing lists for, special interest groups. Your average American is not. Right. So if you are somebody who is somewhat politically engaged, you will be bombarded with fundraising emails anytime anything happens anywhere in the United States that can get you excited about donating to a cause.
Okay, that's a good explanation of why we kind of think in these bubbles that we're all in. The people that want to be in bubbles subscribe to the bubbles and they get more of that. And most people aren't in those political bubbles, they're in their own personal bubbles, but not the, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Let's go back to history. Do we care about the 1853 when Massachusetts required children to be vaccinated in schools? Do we need to go back that far?
I guess the main lesson I would say that we care about when we go back that far is that caring about and making rules that apply during public health crises, and especially during pandemics, is one of the most consistent and oldest roles of government. And even to the extent I would almost say non-controversial, it reaffirmed time and time again, predating the American government to all. I mean, it's one of the few things that actually is even more universal than just the Western legal tradition. Almost every theory of governance gives the power to deal with public health crises to the government. So yes, it's in many legal traditions around the world. It's in the Western tradition. It's in the English tradition. It's in the American tradition. It predates the Constitution. It's codified in the Constitution. It's been carried over in Supreme Court decisions throughout the history of the United States with almost no dissent or even serious qualifications.
The government that fails to protect its citizens is a government that no longer remains in power.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is one of the powers of government. Just full stop.
Well, so I guess I'll jump back to contemporary real quick then. Why is this such a weird controversy? I mean, as a weird stereotype, Republicans are against mandates and Democrats are for mandates. And neither of that is exactly correct, but it sure seems like it.
Well, I guess now we're getting into the sort of nitty gritty of how, and this is where people will disagree and then take their disagreements to the national level, because what counts as public health and what level of government is supposed to be administering it is a separate question. So if you, again, this can be a frustrating answer to people on any side of any public health issue, but it just simply is that we delegate to the states tremendous powers over life, death, public health, and everything that we hold sacred, including voting, living, dying, all of it. And the states have broad powers in those regards. You can find it frustrating that your state's doing one thing and another state's doing another thing, but that doesn't mean it's not legal. Now, and that's with regards to, especially in areas where there is some controversy about efficacy. And the Supreme Court has even, well, I shouldn't say the Supreme Court, but legal scholars have indicated that when there is a sort of level of controversy, there is a preference to let the states work these things out because they tend to be closer to the problem.
But Professor, that's a little too narrow, isn't it? Isn't it broader? Is public health measures a matter of national urgency? Is it in the Constitution?
Yes.
Vaccines and mask mandates and quarantines, is that a matter of national interest? Is it in the Constitution or any of its amendments?
It's yes, because there are, I mean, and there are several powers that you could use to justify not so much the mask mandates, but certainly the vaccine mandates. And the one that is probably the most common and the one that would probably be used in most court cases would be the Commerce Clause, because you'd have a hard time making the case that this pandemic has not affected interstate commerce or the economy of the United States as a whole. So, that's just almost because that one works so well, scholars don't really explore some of the other powers. But I mean, you could even say that because the pandemic affects how you might conduct elections, that the federal government would, I'm just spitballing here, but because how the states can conduct elections, that the federal government would have a role. You could make a national security argument. I mean, for almost every, because a pandemic that kills 600,000 people is an event that is larger than World War II in terms of American deaths. There aren't a lot of powers of government that wouldn't apply to an event that large.
Well, but it's not an enumerated power in the Constitution. The reason that President Biden has said that companies over 100 employees, well, actually, I'm not sure about that, but flight attendants, okay, I get in interstate commerce. So you can say any employee of air transportation or ground transportation has to be vaccinated. I think that is a good argument under the Commerce Clause. But President Biden hasn't mandated, with the exception of employers over 100, mandated that there's going to be vaccines required, right? And the reason for it is because it's not an enumerated power of the federal government. It's implied under the interstate commerce.
Yeah, well, I guess this is where I have to make sure and diverge between what is the current precedent versus what it should be, according to me and my infinite wisdom. Because to me, in my infinite wisdom, I think that the current reading of the Commerce Clause is far too broad.
Agreed.
I mean, the case that is the broadest interpretation of the Commerce Clause was about personal marijuana growth and use. And they determined that, I mean, and to me, this is just taking it way too far, that somehow the growing and consuming of your own marijuana is interstate commerce. Now, I think that's absurd, but that is the current Supreme Court precedent that is operative right now. So if I were to make a prediction about something that the court might be dialing back in the near future, I think that might be dialed back. But as we sit today on September 17th, like that's how broad the Commerce Clause interpretation is right now.
Yeah, Professor, I agree. Going back to my law school training, one of the major cases was the mud flaps on semi trucks, and also the safety bars when some people are getting killed by going underneath. And is that a matter of interstate commerce? Because some states regulated the mud flaps that broke our windshields, and they figured we should standardize this nationwide when they're going on the interstate highways. All trucks must have the following safety equipment. I kind of get that, actually. But has it gone too far? Yeah, it's gone too far. But going back to the inoculations and vaccines, et cetera, is it clear? Let's try to narrow the conversation. Can either the Secretary of Defense or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the President, one of the chain of command, mandate that all people in the military receive a vaccine? Is that just clear, settled law?
Yeah, I think so. Without
congressional action, they could do that by executive order, by constitution. That's just a no-brainer. Yes,
they already do.
They already do. And this shouldn't be any surprise. This is just a no-brainer.
That one is, yeah.
Okay. What about contractors with the military? If you want to do business with the Department of Defense, then you've got to make sure all your employees are vaccinated.
Yeah, I'd say there's pretty much. I mean, let's call that one a 90%. Yeah, okay. There's very little controversy about that.
Okay, we're on the same page. I agree. Maybe I'd go 80%, but okay, cool. What about we're on the same page with interstate commerce? So flight attendants and pilots. Why are we arguing about this? This is a no-brainer. If the federal government wants to say you're going to do interstate commerce, you got to be vaccinated, we should all just go, yeah, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Let's get to the hard one then. And then there'll be one other weird harder one. Let's get to the hard one. All employers over 100, and that's under an agency of the federal government. I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but they regulate ladders and
right. OSHA.
OSHA, thank you. They can do that. If OSHA says this is a health hazard for the citizens of the United States, for some reason over 100, but if you have 98, I guess it's not a health hazard. Can they regulate?
I mean, this is where we begin to. have some controversy. All right. Under the rules as they exist right now, the answer is probably yes, as long as that mandate follows specific procedures for implementation. But and if so that and if I were to guess, if the current Supreme Court would uphold that extremely broad OSHA power, I would say yes, simply because John Roberts in particular has always proven to be deferential towards legislative action. And I think John
You mean
Roberts,
executive action in this? This wasn't legislative.
no. But here, follow me here. John Roberts would say, Congress, you passed this OSHA legislation.
Yeah.
If you don't like it, you need to repeal it.
Yeah.
But this court is here to say that this is the current OSHA law. So I think John Roberts would say, I'm going to defer to the legislature that wrote the original OSHA statute.
And the executive is acting within the authority that Congress authorized.
Yes. So
Okay.
and there is kind of a split here between the conservatives on the court on this issue, because conservatives, other conservatives on the court would say that no, that the very act of passing that OSHA statute is unconstitutional because they've delegated too much of their own power away from
To the executive.
legislative to the executive branch. Whereas Roberts, I think, I mean, I'm guessing here, but I think Roberts would say, if there's a problem with this law, Congress has the power to fix it.
Okay, so cool. That's probably the most difficult currently in this debate. But for some reason, most people aren't talking about these fine nuances. Let me go to an easy one. Let me see if this is an easy one. States, the 50 U.S. states have the authority to mandate vaccines. Yes or no?
It depends on, it depends on the state. For instance, that has almost never been questioned, and states have always had extremely broad powers to mandate vaccines for virtually anybody. I mean,
So why are you not just saying yes? This is an easy answer, Professor. Why is it not yes?
Well, I'm trying to think if there's any counter examples that I can think of, but
I don't think there's one. All 50 states mandate vaccines, period.
Yeah, and I can't think of any cases where it's ever popped up that there was any modification. I mean, you might have specific things about religious exemptions that have been
47 states allow religious exemptions. So that's part of their state, but that's up to them. That's up to the individual state.
Yeah, and some of that stuff overlaps with there is some overlap between things like how you can practice religion when that bumps up against state law will sometimes get to the Supreme Court in some way, but usually it's pretty deferential to whatever the state rules are, and the states can have extremely strict rules too. This religious exemption, for instance, it can be as strict as the religious exemption for the draft. In other words, you can't just roll out of bed one day and say, like, this is my religion. No, you have to prove that you belong to an established religion and that you've been practicing it for a long time, and that you and as part of this religion, that you don't believe in this. You can't. So they can be pretty restrictive.
They can. Yeah, but this isn't like unsettled law.
No,
I mean, you've tried to be very generous here, saying, well, maybe, but the bottom line is this: states have tremendous authority in public health matters.
Yes. I mean, killing someone it affects your health. If you just think the state already has the power to decide what's a death penalty case, and that is literally the state putting you to death. There is no greater power. The
most extreme example of the power of the police state.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that's also, I guess we should mention this because we haven't, but the specific power that the states have to implement things like vaccines does fall under what's called their general policing power. So that is considered general policing power that the state has, that your state and local governments have.
Agreed. So, can you hear me, Professor?
Yeah.
Good. We're settled on that, but we'll see what questions people have. Let's handle another easy one. Can I demand or mandate that anyone that comes into my private home wear a mask or be vaccinated or whatever else thing? Is in my private property, in my home that I own, can I just be the authoritarian rule that I can ask and demand?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot, his audio caught out, but yes, your home is your castle and you are sovereign in your home as long as you're not doing anything that is, contrary to public health. I mean, you're not allowed to have a meth lab in it, or you're not allowed to build biological weapons in it, but generally speaking, you can do whatever you want in your house.
Yeah, and demand whatever guests are in here to go by my rules.
Yep.
How about as a business? I have a restaurant, or I have a law firm, or I have a whatever. Am I allowed to demand that my customers or clients or employees do what I want as an employer? It's my property, it's my business. Can I demand that you have a vaccine?
No.
Are you sure?
You have to follow, businesses have licenses and all economic activity is chartered by the state, and you're governed by public accommodation laws that come from the state. So,
aren't those prohibited classes? As long as, if I ask everyone to wear a hat into my business, as long as it's not a discriminatory class, can I require that? If you don't wear a hat, you're not coming to my business?
Yes. Like I said, as long as it's not contrary to state law, then yes. So I thought you were asking something different, because if you're asking me about vaccines,
yes,
then the business is beholden to public accommodation and general policing power rules over vaccination. But if you're saying that this business requires a jacket to eat dinner there, then yes, that business can require a jacket to eat dinner there.
So we may have a nuance here, because I think you're incorrect on the vaccine part. You're saying that if I require all my employees to have a vaccine to work for me.
No, hold on. I'm saying if the state is requiring that.
No, I don't care about the state. I'm just saying I own a business and I'm requiring my employees or my customers to have a vaccine or a mask or a proof of not being sick. Then I can do that as an individual business owner on my property. I can mandate that.
I just don't know that. I don't know. I don't know that, because I'd like to see a test case on this, because one of the things that you have as a, it's different for public versus private employers. Under the Biden rule, I mean, you have to do whatever the government says. So I'm trying to imagine a scenario where the government hadn't already weighed in on this, but because there are already government laws mandating how employers have to act in this regard, I'm wondering if there is even a possible hypothetical here. Does that make sense? There almost can't be a hypothetical, because there are already rules about this kind of stuff. If you were to present it as something other than a vaccine mandate, it might fall under something dealing with medical privacy, for instance. Your employer doesn't have the right to know everything about your medical history.
Mm-hmm. So, Professor, this is an interesting one. This is the first time out of 29 or 40 shows that either of us don't quite have a semi-authoritative answer. I would ask us to do a quick reprisal on this in another week or two. My premise is that if it's my business and I own the property, I can say, thou shalt not enter my business without full vaccination against whatever I want, smallpox or COVID-19. Do not enter. Then it's a potential lawsuit if somebody enters against my prohibition. I own my property. I own my business. I can require it from my employees and my customers.
I
I
see.
think that's
So,
settled.
yes. Well, okay. No. All right. I think I just was imagining a different hypothetical. There are certainly cases of business owners who, when COVID hit, simply closed their doors and said, and then made new rules for themselves and their employees about how they would conduct business. And as long as those did not conflict with state, local, and federal laws, yes, they could manage the comings and goings in their businesses and do so legally. I guess I was having a hard time imagining a hypothetical there.
Okay. Well, I think this is actually the crux of what many small businesses and large businesses are trying to figure out. What should they do? And by the way, just we haven't talked about this, but we're going to go to open questions here. All of this, I have a premise, Professor. Yes, President Biden's important. And yes, Congress is important, and governors and individual county health departments are important. All of them are important. The premise is that I have is all of this is being driven by health insurance, insurance liability companies, and lawyers, risk management. They're all trying to figure out how to prevent extreme damage in law cases in the future should an employee or customers damage the business, or more likely the owner didn't take the right level of care for their employees, and an employee dies and their survivors sue the company, and they just had a wanton disregard towards local healthcare policy. That's what all this is being driven by,
Yes.
is my opinion. Do you agree with that?
I wouldn't say all, because I do believe that there are a lot of people who have, sincere, if again, in my opinion, misguided, but they are sincere objections to this vaccine for some reason. But I think you're right in terms of what business, especially in terms of what businesses really need. What businesses need during a time of crisis is they need clarity. They need to know if they operate their business under these circumstances, that they won't be subjected to frivolous lawsuits. They want predictability. They just want to know what the rules are. Because as long as the rules are the same for everybody, business people can adapt to the new business environment. But in a time when there isn't clarity, businesses will be afraid to act, and especially afraid to act boldly. So I think that the more legislative clarity that Congress could provide, and I would prefer that it come from Congress, not necessarily from OSHA or from the Biden administration. But
agreed with that. But why do you say Congress rather than just leave it up to the states? Because this whole context is a discussion on federalism. Why not just have all the states do the right thing?
I guess because of the current broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause, and we're talking, and if you're engaged in business, there, under current statutes, almost anyone who's engaged in a public business is engaged in interstate commerce.
Oh, do you really believe that, Professor? We got to have a whole conversation on that. I think that's too much of a broad statement.
Well, I'm not saying that that's ideal. I'm saying that because I'm concerned about making sure that businesses have predictability, and what I would hate to see is somebody from Rhode Island suing somebody from Colorado because of the difference in how they interpreted liability statutes or something like that. So that's why I'm saying that what I would prefer to see from Congress is some legal clarity about protecting businesses from lawsuits in all states.
Well, agreed, but Congress already had that discussion a year ago and declined. Republicans were advocating immunity from lawsuits regarding COVID, and I think it was the Democrats, I'm not positive, but I think it was the Democrats that stopped that. They want the ability to be able to sue over this. So for right now, we're in no man's land on what's going to happen. Is that true or not?
Yes, and this is the frustration. I wish we could get a bunch of presidents who agreed with Ulysses S. Grant, which said, "I know of no." I mean, we've had this tendency when bad law is on the books to just ignore the law instead of fixing the law, and to let Congress off the hook when they're not fixing bad laws. And so, some Republicans have done this too. Some of the more egregious examples of this came from the Trump and Obama White Houses, where they would simply not enforce laws that they didn't like. And it's just a 180 from what Ulysses S. Grant said in his inaugural, which is, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, "I know of no method to repeal a bad." I'm sure Jason Nelson can find this while I'm saying it and messing it up, but "I know of no method to repeal a bad law so much as its stringent execution or implementation." Basically, I'm going to show you that this is a bad law by actually enforcing it.
Yeah. Professor, let me end with this question, then we'll open it up to Q&A for a half hour. Does your observations of what you've seen on media and social media and newsletters and your own Facebook page, our current dialogue, what people, citizens and Facebook users and both, are we arguing about the right things? To me, it doesn't make sense that it seems like it's just yay or nay, left and right, black or white, but it doesn't have the nuance of federalism. Why are we arguing that it's 100% mask or vaccines? To me, the argument doesn't make sense. Give your perspective on that, and we'll open it up to Q&A.
I mean, what I see in social media is it almost always starts with a bumper sticker version of something, or it's but a meme, right? And you'll see a meme that says one thing, and it is almost always something that is absurd, as stated, and based on a misunderstanding of how laws are applied in the United States. And then people will start arguing over the meme and never actually get to the heart of the matter. And people are not necessarily interested in that once that happens. They're more interested in, winning the thread.
Yeah, but it's a once in a century pandemic and we need to keep our economy moving. Why are we not talking about substantive stuff? That's a rhetorical question. Commissioner Jerky, I know you were a state legislator, but commissioner is more important because you had control over your local health department in Weld County. What's your question?
Well, I don't know exactly which one to ask right away, but most of what we did as commissioners kind of revolved around health, safety, and welfare. I guess my question would be, where is that founded then in state government or federal law or courts that commissioners were given such broad powers to be able to go and do anything to affect health, safety, and welfare? That's so broad, so big.
And Professor, let me jump in and you can correct me. But Commissioner Jerky, you know this, and you may not know the case, but it's not the 1905 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Jacobson versus Massachusetts. You can't deprive your neighbors of their own liberty. County health departments under your control, or mine previously, had tremendous discretion to protect their citizens. So it wasn't in the federal constitution. It was not an enumerated clause. It was given to the several states, and by state constitution and statute, it devolved it down to the local level where medical professionals could evaluate the needs of their own citizens. I mean, and so of course they wanted to protect their citizens. Everybody did. If there was smallpox or some other crisis coming on, you trust your local doctors under the local elected officials. Sorry to give you my own opinion, but you know that, right? Don't you?
And let me add that nothing excited our health department professionals more than a good disease. Okay, they really got excited with West Nile.
But that's their job. They went to school for it. They were trained.
They were doing their Fauci impersonations. So excited to finally be in power.
Sure, but they were under your control, though, as a commissioner. Didn't you have your own Weld County Health Department?
We were, and we had like a recommendation health department, but then the commissioners were the final stopper on health department commissioners.
Right, good. The system works.
It works, and I think it could work well for, say, Douglas County. that's looking to take over and do their own thing now.
And by the way, that's a nuanced in Colorado discussion that I'm happy to have if we have time, because I have a strong opinion on that that's not popular. Professor Tootle, sorry to jump in.
No, that's all right. I just was also curious if he was my commissioner when I lived in Weld County from 2000.
He is really old,
But
Professor Tootle.
2004
Probably
to
your commissioner. When were you a commissioner, Jerky?
01 through 08, and
Yeah.
yes, I would have been your commissioner, I guess.
Wow. So I lived under your rule.
You survived, see, yeah.
And the more important question is,
the rule was fair and just.
did you vote for him? Is the more important question, Commissioner
Did
Jerky.
you vote? Did you vote for me?
I don't remember. I'm sure I did.
So, Professor Tootle, were you comfortable with my answer?
Yes, I would just state that I mean, if you think about it, that when I said the general policing power, the same power that gives the Weld County the ability to have a sheriff's department is the power that allows them to regulate the health and safety of the people in that county. So it just falls under, and that's one of the reasons why it almost didn't need to be specified, because it has always fallen under the general policing power.
And although uncomfortable, and I admit I'm human, I'm uncomfortable with other states' policies, and I'm also uncomfortable with other nations' policies. I admit. But in general principles, I really want government to be at the local, smallest level possible.
Well, what we want is, I mean, in particular, a public health pandemic can affect different regions of the country differently. So in a sense, what you want is this mix of federal, state, and local, each one doing their appropriate jobs. So for instance, in some areas that already have a lot of outdoor dining, that you want the state and local governments to be able to make some sort of common sense accommodations so that businesses can continue to function in that. And those conditions might be very different in Florida or San Diego than they are in Minnesota, in St. Paul in January. You know, those are going to be very San Diego any day is different than St. Paul in January. So what you want to have is you want the local government and counties making rules that make sense for their citizens, but then in the cases where you have citizens who are also traveling and being engaged in interstate commerce, that's when you need to begin to have the intervention of state laws and federal law.
Yeah, makes sense. Okay, we have 15 minutes left, lots of time for Q&A. Commissioner Jerky, you're happy to have a second bite at the apple, depending on how folks go. Who's up? Hey, Kenton, you're new to this. I think you joined us from LinkedIn. Do you have any questions? Since you're a newcomer, we're going to give you a special opportunity to say hello.
Hello. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I did post a question, and I asked if you had already talked about the emergency powers under an emergency situation given to someone like FEMA or the state health organization, et cetera. That's an undiscussed subject when it comes to this. As soon as the executive says we have an emergency, then they take over. And for instance, I'm thinking Polis is really not acting as Polis. He's actually, because he's being told by the health department to do certain things, because he gets the blame. But is that the case? Am I off on that?
So no, you're not off. And I think it is probably the strongest case that people have for who are critics of, for instance, the vaccine mandate, is that, and essentially you have I guess I can argue both sides. So on one side, here's the Biden argument, which is that the current crisis we are in now is not the same crisis that we were in before. So their argument is that that we had a pandemic pre-vaccines, and it looked like enough people were going to voluntarily vaccinate, which I didn't believe at the time, but whatever, it's a reasonable guess that enough people, and the pandemic seemed to be ending through the summer. And therefore, it was fine when a lot of those initial emergency declarations expired. And their argument is that this new vaccine mandate is not a reaction to the pandemic starting, but essentially the Delta variant changing and creating a new emergency power. The Supreme Court and a lot of the circuit courts have been less patient about this because of this tendency that states have had to not want to give up their emergency powers ever. And the Supreme Court has already, we've had these hints that they don't have a lot of patience for pandemic law, meaning we're going to decide these laws and everything is an emergency and all of these powers are permanent. So you, in a way, and there's also something else about, I suspect that the vaccine mandate from the Biden administration will probably survive constitutional scrutiny, but I think you're right that the best and most likely way that it could possibly be found to be unconstitutional would be to go after this extension of emergency powers.
Okay.
Kenton, is that good enough for you? I've got a follow-up question if you're good with that.
Yeah, I'm good with that. And that's exactly what I've been
Okay.
hearing from the people who are not just pontificating on social media, and that is
Right.
the emergency powers are the problem. And if we get rid of the emergency powers, then we get back to the Constitution.
Okay, I think that's a healthy nuance. Mine's a slightly different nuance, Professor, that I've already led you through on my series of questions. I think it's very clear that states can do almost whatever they want in a matter of a pandemic. They have enormous powers by a federal constitution, limited by their own state constitutions or legislative action, but they have enormous power. I also think individuals, my home, or if I owned a business that I operate, have enormous powers to say what they want out of their employees and their customers. I'm not so certain on the federal government powers of all employers over 100. I think in powers that clearly are interstate commerce, aircraft, and they probably have that power. I'm not just say every employer in the country over 100 employees, you have to mandate it on your. I'm not certain about that. I think that could be unconstitutional. That's the biggest nuance I have. What do you think about my premises or any others in between those spectrum?
Well, I mean, again, I'm not disagreeing with you about what should be. I'm just telling you kind of what is under the, and maybe the Supreme Court will use this opportunity to begin really dialing back this freight train of the Commerce Clause, which they've really only done once before in a gun rights case where they said, come on, carrying a gun isn't interstate commerce, but other than that, I mean, it's like this weapon that people wield, the Commerce Clause, that they can beat you up with and do almost anything they want. So I think you're right, and maybe the Supreme Court will begin dialing it back. What I was talking about when I meant, again, yes, states have tremendous powers, but for instance, many states changed their voting procedures because of the pandemic, and the Supreme Court has had no patience with the idea that those changes are going to be permanent. So in other words, by the next round of elections, I think if there are certain states that try to extend those emergency rules with regard to voting, I think you will see some lawsuits, and I think you will see the Supreme Court striking those down.
But on the contrary, they can set, just by analogy, they can set whatever law they want on how their elections are done by state. just
Yes.
not under emergency powers.
Right. But I just mean governors waving magic wands.
Yeah. Oh, under executive power. That's
Right.
correct. Yeah, good. And sorry to be so nuanced and precise on this. I just wish citizens would just learn a little bit about our government so they can make a better argument on whatever they'd like to make.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we can hope.
Which is why we're doing these conversations. Ron, you're a newcomer to our team. Do you have a quick question? You don't have to, but if you do, take yourself off mic. Go ahead.
I appreciate it, John, but no, I'm good. Just gathering information.
Love it. Okay. Who else is up? Bart, you're our attorney in residence. You wrote the state laws of Colorado for over 30 years. You might as well educate Professor Tootle on how he's wrong.
Actually, I'm sorry about that. I was just unmuting myself. I muted myself in order to stop the camera. It was okay.
You're good.
I'm back. I am really grateful that we're doing this discussion today because I've heard so much misinformation in the mainstream media and the non-mainstream media the last few days about the impending federal requirements, whatever they're going to be. Because, initially people didn't realize that there were no rules yet. Biden had announced that they wanted to do this, but the agencies haven't done anything yet. So you can't file a lawsuit yet because nothing's been done. So people don't even seem to understand that aspect of what's going on. And I think it's great because this is a perfect example of an issue where we really do need to talk about what are the facts. And, the governments all over the country, including the federal government, have been mandating vaccines for pretty much the entire history of the country, as Professor Tootle was saying. Even George Washington, before we were a country, thought it was a good idea.
I think it was 1777, Bart, not 1776.
Okay.
All right.
You're right. So this is not really new territory, and there is law on it, and it's interesting.
Bart, I don't know if it's a distinction, but between California, but it's in the California Constitution that the UC system can mandate vaccines.
Wow. That's interesting. In the Constitution, huh?
Yeah, not for the other systems, but obviously they have. Actually, my system, the community college system, is the only one that hasn't mandated what they're calling a hard vaccine mandate. Ours is still
so Bart and Professor Tootle, in that instance, when a single state has it in constitution for a specific state legislative authorized organization, colleges, this is a no-brainer. That's like 100% settled law. And we should just say that if you don't want to be an employee of that institution, or if you don't want to be a student of that institution, don't be an employee or a student. And we should just say done, right?
Yeah, and I think, we've had several issues like this. I don't know, Bart, if you agree with me on this, but doesn't it seem like we always come back to the free speech versus compelled speech kind of yes, you have the right to free speech, but you also have the right to be free of compelled speech. You have the right to work where you want to work, but you don't have the right to demand a job from every employer. And you have the right to quit your job. We have a lot of freedoms, but the purpose of politics is to negotiate between these freedoms in a peaceful way under rule of law.
Freedom of association in addition to speech. Totally agree, right, Bart?
Yes, actually I do, yeah.
Well, then why do we have these stupid arguments all the time? Why don't we take more if you don't like the California Constitution, in California, change that Constitution. That's easy, isn't it?
It's exceedingly easy in California. We
that's true.
Referendum, recall.
Right.
Our Constitution is a mess. Yeah.
Well, but my point on that is that just as businesses want stability or consistency, so do individuals. We want to know how to raise our families and our ability. We want the ability to look at the law to know how we can engage in society. So if you don't like the law, change it, right?
Yeah, and presumably the place where you can do that most effectively is in the places where you know the people.
And the lowest level possible. Yeah, your city, your county, and then your state, then finally federal.
Yeah.
Okay. Who else has a question? Otherwise, we only have 4 minutes left. Jump in, Jake.
Okay, so I just want to premise this by saying I am in favor of federalism and having each state determine, the vaccine requirements. I'm not in favor of the federal government, doing a blanket statement for the reasons we've already discussed, how there's different circumstances, in Minnesota as opposed to Florida. However, I just go back to the Korematsu case where the Supreme Court said, yes, you do have a constitutional right to due process. However, we are in a time of national crisis, so we are ignoring the Constitution and throwing you in a prison camp. Now, obviously, we were in a declared war at that time, so you have presidential war powers that come into it. But the rhetoric that the Biden and also the Trump administration have used about the pandemic is they're comparing it to a war. And as has been mentioned in the chat, we currently have more people dead from the pandemic than have died in both world wars combined. And so couldn't the Biden administration make an argument that this is some kind of, a special emergency where they should be able to do a national mandate?
Wow. Interesting question. Professor Tootle.
It's interesting because a national mandate is something that would almost have to work through the states in their general policing powers. In other words, I'm thinking about anytime there was a national mandate that came down that involved immediate action, you think about something like a draft, right? And drafts are always end up having to be implemented by local draft boards. So generally speaking, the federal government can't interfere with you if you aren't touching anybody else. Even your right to be left alone versus your right to have the government mess with you. I'm thinking about like an extreme case of a hermit or a cattle rancher living off on his own. Does the government have the right to come and hold him down and give him a shot? Just in terms of making that happen on a practical level.
Well, okay, let me interrupt you, Professor.
I'd hate
Jake,
to. It'd be interesting. I just don't know how it could be implemented outside of as a purely federal thing. Does that make sense?
Well, so no, let me interrupt you, Professor. So Jake, to your question, right now, and I know people argue about the facts, I get it, but right now slightly over 1 out of 500 Americans have died from COVID. And without all these crazy restrictions that we've had, maybe it would be 1 out of 100, maybe even 1 out of 250. At a certain point, if the society is getting annihilated, there's been some nasty diseases in the history of the world, the bubonic plague and well, I have to ask the history professor when that was, the Dark Ages. 1 out of 2 people get killed. At a certain point, sure, the federal government's going to act.
Yes. I just, Jake, your question, again, it sort of implies a hypothetical because of the question of how he would do this. The closest analogy would be something like a draft. It'd have to be like where I'm declaring a war. I just don't know how that would pass constitutional muster. It would be just such a stretch to say that because this is as deadly as a war, that because the other thing is that civil society is still functioning. I mean, I guess, all right, here's my constitutional hypothetical for you. Because the president has one of the reasons the president has broad war-making powers is because of when there is an emergency or when there is a crisis, government's not functioning, civil society is not functioning. And at that point, it is the federal government that can go in and have that general policing power. So, for instance, during the Civil War, when the South declared itself in rebellion, they're the ones who gave Lincoln the constitutional authority to go in and establish law, because those areas were not sending congressmen to Washington, D.C. But during this pandemic, civil society is still functioning. Yeah. I'm still going to work. The streetlights are still operating. The trash.
That's a great nuance.
The trash got picked up. So I just don't know if it's analogous to that kind of emergency, because civil society is still functioning.
Yeah, I love that answer. But the answer is we don't know yet how dangerous this damn virus is. I mean, we have some pretty good inclinations, but it could get a lot worse, or maybe it's going to go away. We just don't know yet.
Well, because something else that's kind of puzzling me is all of these powers that the CDC is taking on, like how they issued the eviction moratorium. And then you have Nancy Pelosi, who's Speaker of the House, commenting and saying, we need the CDC to extend the moratorium. It's like, well, you're the Speaker of the House. Why don't you have Congress pass a law? Why are we having this one agency do it?
Great distinction.
And I guess their answer would be, we already have the authority under the existing OSHA statute.
Same with the War Powers Clause, and it's same issue. I don't want to end on that. Last question from any members of the team. Anybody that called in today have a quick question for a quick answer? Bart, are you still on?
Well,
Yes, I'm still here.
Yeah.
Well, but you're on mute, or you're off mute. Do you have a question?
Oh, actually, no.
Fair
That
enough.
last discussion took care of my question. So
Okay, fair enough. Okay, last call, team. All right, Professor Tootle, why don't you summarize whatever you'd like to from my questions or of our people that joined us. Why don't you finish off in 2 or 3 minutes and we'll declare victory for today.
Well, I just say that while there are some interesting hypotheticals that a unique crisis tends to bring out in our legal tradition and in our political culture, that generally speaking, a crisis is not a great place to make permanent law. And it's more important during times of crisis to really think about our fundamental principles and how to apply the fundamental principles to the crisis, rather than let the crisis change your principles. And so with that in mind, we've had some discussions about the way things are versus the way things we would hope things are. But I think that if you want to have a more productive conversation with anybody on these issues, I would say start with the way things are, establish that you agree on the basic facts, and then, and only then, have the discussion about the way things should be. I think the important first step is acknowledging, getting all parties involved in the discussion to acknowledge reality first.
Let's finish with that. That's excellent. Team, a reminder that we have a YouTube channel, and you can see all of our discussions or share it from Tootle Talks on YouTube. We also have a small Facebook group which we give you notifications of coming events or things that have happened in the past or we'd like to talk. So please, if we get like another 20 folks, we can name our YouTube channel Tootle Talks. So please subscribe to that. Right now it's just some miscellaneous thing. So thank you for joining us today. We are going to chat for just 3 or 4 minutes after we stop the recording, which I'm going to do, I think. Well, actually,